Hi everyone, welcome. We're down here in my wormery, and the arrangement in general of my bins down here is the newest stuff is off here to the right, with the oldest stuff being all the way over there to the left, kind of a left to right reading. The only exception is the middle shelf where I go left to right up top, and then it switches back just there, and then everything else goes to the right again. As you can see, all the newest systems of mine, whether it's bubble wrap, whether it's plastic bags, whatever the case may be, I protect all my newer systems from evaporation using some sort of a plastic. It's my answer to covers, since none of my bus bins have covers. And eventually, as time goes on, as the castings begin piling up and there's fewer bits of leaves and cardboard and the typical bedding type materials one uses to build their worm bins, it does seem that the material has a greater tendency to hang on to its moisture. And then the other variable affecting moisture in the bins, besides the concentration of castings, is the atmosphere in the house. And here I'm kind of undergoing that transition from cold weather to warm weather at the beginning of summer, where the furnace is running much less, if at all anymore. And the furnace is what contributes greatly during the winter time to dry air in my house. So once that stops happening, once the furnace stops running, the moisture content in the air in my house rises, the humidity level rises, and as that occurs, all my systems tend to hang on to their moisture much more readily. I've been noticing a lot of moisture buildup in a lot of my systems, and over time I've been gradually removing plastic coverings. You can see paper coverings only down there on some of the systems over there. Even here, to the greater extreme, on some of the systems where I'm already undergoing horizontal migration, the only purpose of plastic anymore is to cover the feeding zones to make sure that that part of the system stays nice and damp to draw the worms to it, allowing for the rest of the material, the castings themselves, to dry, ideally making an environment that the worms want to exit on their own. So now, I guess the one anomaly over here is these two systems of African night crawlers that are now due for a feeding after 12 days since the last check-in. There was actually a period of time prior to the last check-in when one of the systems was covered without plastic to allow for some drying, but during the last check-in it seemed like things had stabilized, so the plastic covering went back on. But I'm beginning to wonder if we might want to return to maybe just a paper-only covering in those. So we're going to get those systems up on the bench to feed them, and if we find that the moisture level is a bit high, we will be transitioning to something other than plastic to cover up with. So let's get them up on the bench and we're going to get to work. There were a couple systems that I fed yesterday or the day before recently that really startled me when I first removed the plastic coverings. I was able to tell right away that moisture had gotten really out of control, and then once I actually started plowing through the material, that's when it really reveals itself by just the clumpiness. You try to grab some material and it holds together in just a big huge mound, and it doesn't flake apart whatsoever. I'm really hoping that we've not gotten to that point here. The last feeding did consist of stuff that would have brought with it very little, if any, moisture, just coffee. And I sort of anticipated that we might be in a similar situation today, so once again I came prepared with food that I assumed would bring with it minimal moisture, some banana peels, obviously a little bit of moisture content, but not much. Not like a big juicy tomato or some cucumbers or watermelon or something like that. And then coffee as well, which there too is hanging on to some of the moisture from when it was still in the coffee maker, but a minimal amount. It's mainly just a food substance. So let's see here, I'm contemplating I think it's a lost cause with this one. I was just wondering whether we'd be able to utilize any of this top covering newspaper as top covering newspaper anymore. And it's unusually holding together, believe it or not. I don't know, do we set it aside and try to use it that way one more time? Here too, my feeding zone indicator doesn't need to be retained as a feeding zone indicator anymore, because the coffee filters, which is what I typically use as feeding zone indicators that we bought down with the coffee today, can be used that way. This piece of newspaper, however, I believe was the one, yeah, this was the system on which we had excluded the plastic covering for one interval between feedings to allow for some drying. But last time we noticed how the material in the system was nice and crumbly, and it didn't seem like further drying would be required, so we just returned back to keeping the plastic coverings on here. And here too, this feeding zone indicator is definitely holding up pretty good. Been nibbled through a little bit by the worms, but I guess I'm leaning towards perhaps using all that stuff as supplementary bedding down underneath the feeding, because last time too, all we did was we took some used napkins. I'm smearing castings all over the place, making a mess here. So used paper towels were the basis or the foundation for the food that we applied last time. So if we plow down through the middle of the system to check out how they did on that last feeding, we might encounter some residual bits of the napkins, or maybe not. This I don't know. This is probably a napkin. It's one of those fancy yellow napkins that I bring home from my mom's place sometimes. And it's just kind of in a mound, you know, so that would make for a difficult thing for the worms to work their way through. I mean, in time it'll get worked down, but it's, you know, just a mass which only the outer surface is exposed to any sort of worm traffic or activity, and whatever's sort of clumped up down in the middle of the whole thing is, you know, protected from any sort of breakdown process. It is very difficult to unfold a damp napkin, though. Perhaps a piece of newspaper that's been folded over still has the possibility of being unfolded. But I think with a napkin we're just going to have to maybe give it a little tear at best, but I don't think unfolding it is even an option anymore. This too, I believe, is some of the stuff we might have used as the bedding material underneath the feeding last time. More paper products, nothing shredded, just large chunks of paper. I guess as systems start to get a little bit older, like these systems are now, 301 days of age, which is 43 weeks, I start to think that maybe utilizing stuff like this, shredded paper and cardboard bits, is the sort of thing that I might want to steer away from, because that stuff all still needs to break down. I wouldn't want to put more fresh stuff like that in, potentially leaving the material littered with that all over the place. At least somewhat larger clumpy stuff, even though they're going to be much slower on the breakdown, are much easier to extract and remove should we get to a point where we decide it might be time to think about harvesting the castings, and we wouldn't want to have all kinds of materials littering the castings. I must say I'm very pleased with the fact that things have not gotten out of control here. Things are adequately damp and comfortable for the worms, but luckily not at that point where it's getting really clumpy and unmanageable, because that really is, to me, the measure, you know, the manageability. I like knowing that if I really wanted to, I could sift this material, possibly, you know, using a light separation method where the bright lights would cause the worms to dive down deeper and deeper, and then I could do a quick skim of the material off the top, and then quickly running it through a screen would allow me to separate any sort of residual little bits of uncomposted stuff from it. And then that's sort of the quick way to separate worms from their castings. Although quick is a relative term, I'm just using the expression quick relative to the other method, which is what I demonstrated earlier up on the shelf, which is the migration method, which sometimes could take weeks, maybe even months. And a couple of those older systems, I think we're almost approaching 2 months where the systems have been migrating. And there too, the main reason it took so long was because the material had gotten so damp that the worms had virtually no motivation to exit the material. And slowly but surely I got wise to the fact that I really needed to take some extra measures, so I started just leaving the systems uncovered, coming back periodically to till the material up, aerate it, and eventually the material did finally get to that drier point where the worms started actually leaving it on their own. And since it is sort of a voluntary process where the worms are in part being lured to the feeding area by moisture and yummy foods. It's also a game of repulsion too, where the old material has been left without any food in it, eventually also being left with minimal or an uncomfortable amount of moisture in it, kind of driving the worms away. So there is sort of that push-pull sort of approach where I believe that the push seems to have a much greater effect. You know, the pull, the draw, the attraction approach of it, setting up a nice feeding area on one end of the bin with yummy foods and whatnot, only gets you so far, because as long as the worms are still in material that they're comfortable hanging out in, they're not going to be motivated to get moving looking for something better. It does seem like the repellent or repulsion approach of letting the material become uncomfortable for them a little bit is the best way to stimulate migration. And I guess at some point in the future, I like the option of picking either approach of separating worms from their castings. And I kind of like the migration approach because I'm typically not in much of a hurry. And I like the idea of letting the worms do all the work, but you know, the cost of doing it that way is the amount of time it takes. And I must say, I've had occasions where I've run the bin in a way where the material was already dry enough from the very beginning that as soon as I set up the migration area for them, they came running. They would stumble on that and they would find that there was nice moisture, nice food, and then they would stay. And I managed to complete migrations of worms out of their materials in very short periods of times. However, in some cases, like the examples of the systems behind me, in one of the cases, I believe that the system's already been running close to 2 months. And finally, the material is starting to dry out to the point where it seems like there's a far fewer quantity of worms in the material. But it took a long time, you know. And the more humid air in the house is also not helping. So, all right, well, we've managed to excavate down into the feeding areas in both systems. And I believe we're going to just reuse all of this recycled bedding material. There was also an old food item down in here, the stem of a pumpkin. And in addition to that, I think it probably does make sense to just come back in here with all this old top covering newspaper and place that into the feeding area as well in both bins. And this way we're not bringing in any of my shredded paper cardboard mix, my prepared bedding. We're just really making use of stuff that's already in the systems. Stuff which has the advantage of being loaded with all the microorganisms that the worms really like to have around. So that usually inspires the worms to nibble on the paper products and the leaves and stuff like that when they're already infiltrated with all the microbes and bacteria and fungi and stuff like that, as opposed to just placing stuff in sterile and fresh. That stuff needs a little time to sort of warm up to the point where the worms are attracted to it and happy to start nibbling on that as well. So here too is just the stem of a grape or something like that. These are all larger objects. I believe this too is just a chunk of pumpkin stem. These are all large enough objects that I think we can pretty easily extract them at some point in the future, should we decide that it was time to try separating the worms from their material. It's just all this minuscule itsy bitsy stuff, all these scraps of shredded paper cardboard, all these leaf stems. These are all the things that are still going to require some time, but at 301 days of age, these systems, I believe, still have a way to go before they're going to reach the finish line. So I'm not too worried about it, but it does sometimes pay to think ahead a little bit and start anticipating what your next moves are going to be and do things that set the stage for those moves to occur smoothly and easily versus, you know, having a situation where you're kind of in an uphill battle trying to get something to happen that just doesn't really want to happen on its own. So those two filters are going to be our replacement feeding zone indicators. What I've piled in so far is just a day's worth of coffee into each system, and what I'm doing now is just sprinkling some of my worm chow in to try to spice that stuff up to make it a somewhat more appealing food item. And then the only other thing that's going into each of these systems is a banana peel. So it's certainly not a huge feeding. It's hopefully it's, going to satisfy their needs to a certain point, but I'd also like for them to really spend a little bit more time breaking down all the residual paper products and bedding bits that remain in each of these systems, so that what we're left with at some point in the near future is really just systems with castings only in them. I've also got my grit here. I've got a little bit of this pulverized eggshell that we're going to sprinkle in on top of the banana peels, just because it's stuff that helps the worms digest their foods. All right, what have we here now? So I guess at this point we're kind of ready to start backfilling the feeding areas. I've gotten feedback from some people on what I'm doing here in terms of how the systems are laid out in front of the camera. In the past, I would typically pull one system up, tend to its needs, remove it from the table, and then bring out the next system to be worked on. And it was a few months ago that I decided, hey, why don't I see if I can fit both systems that have been buddied up, or two systems that are sort of buddy bins or sister bins, and see if we can kind of run them side by side in the video and almost work on them in tandem, or at once, if you will, as if they were just simply one large bin. So you might have noticed I excavated, I fed, and now I'm also at the same time sort of just backfilling and also examining this outer edge of the system as if I was simply working on just one large bin. And I know there's also some disadvantages here. Some people like it, some people don't like it as much. I mean, one viewer did comment how they prefer how when I'm running the one at a time approach to checking in on the bins, the attention to detail to each bin is the focal point versus trying to pretend as if it's just one large system. I guess when I'm only doing one bin at a time, the camera is able to get a little bit closer too, and there's probably an increased amount of detail and better visibility into what's going on. So there's definitely pros and cons. I originally started doing this with just a pair of European nightcrawler bins. At one point, I don't know, it might have even been these two systems that I inaugurated this approach with. I don't recall. It might be, now that I come to think of it. For some reason, I think it is these two systems where we started doing it for the first time. Then it just sort of started catching on. Started doing it this way in all my systems. So I think I'm kind of at that decision point here as I try to also just quickly aerate and till up the outer edge that's furthest from me, just to make sure everything's in good shape. And then we'll be done, and then the last thing to do here is going to be to cover up and put away, and how we cover up is the thing that's in question, whether I want to return the plastic. Is there a risk of things getting muddy and out of control here? Or are we in good enough shape to hang on to the plastic covering so as to not let the system dry out any further? And I guess that's kind of my gut feeling here, is despite the fairly ample quantity of moisture I'm observing in all the material, I don't sense anywhere that the material is getting overly muddy or clumpy or excessively moist or damp. It was what I worried about when I came in here originally, but I don't think my worries were realized, thank goodness. It does seem to me like we're still dealing with material that's relatively granular and easily flowing for the most part, I would say. Not entirely, because the stuff still does clump up to a certain degree, but not like I was seeing in some of my other systems where it really just you know, you grabbed a handful and it stayed in that one huge mound and it just wouldn't crumble whatsoever. So I am sort of leaning towards returning the plastic coverings and letting them continue more or less the way we found them. I guess the only thing we're missing here now is paper coverings that were between the material and the plastic coverings. So I think I'm going to grab a couple pieces of newspaper. So I'm going to have to take a short break here just to do that, but I'll be right back. Alrighty, here we go. So you saw how popular the top covering papers were, both the feeding zone indicators and the top covering newspapers. Especially in this bin, they got nibbled up almost entirely to the point where they just flaked apart into little tiny pieces. Here they were somewhat newer and they held together a little bit better, but the worms definitely like the paper being there right beneath the surface, or at least right beneath the plastic coverings, because all the moisture that would otherwise evaporate and gets caught in these plastics or on the plastic and then condenses and drops back down causes sort of a heightened amount of moisture that collects on these top covering papers, and then the worms really do seem to come out for that in great numbers, and while they're there they nibble on that paper. So I think we're making the right choice here. I'm definitely interested in hearing what people think in terms of my decision here to go back with the plastic coverings. I guess I would have that option here to maybe even cinch back the edge of these pieces of plastic a little bit away from the edge to allow for a little bit of airflow, but you know what? I think we're just going to take our chances. We're going to take our chances with that dry piece of paper being there to potentially absorb a little bit of moisture should it be necessary, and just hope that things don't get out of control here. But then again, the introduction of no additional moisture and the foods that we added, or at least a minimal amount, I'm assuming is going to put us in a situation where we're going to be in good shape. At least I hope so. I really regret coming back here and finding that I had made the wrong decision, but I think we're going to be okay. Hopefully you agree. All right, everyone. I've got a few things I got to take care of getting cleaned up and put away, but I'm not going to waste your time with that. That's boring. Before I go there really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.